I'm not actually hearing anything.
quiet.
Good evening, good evening, good evening, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our fifth and final day of Black Lives Matter at School, Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action. I'm going to make a brief announcement about interpretation services. I would like to point you to the globe at the bottom of your screen where you will select the language in which you choose for interpretation today. I will turn it over to the Spanish interpreter.
Bienvenidos y gracias por estar en esta junta virtual del movimiento Las Vidas Negras Importan, la Semana de Acción. Para poder acceder a esta transmisión en español, ustedes van a ver un globo tipo mundo en la parte baja de la pantalla. Ustedes van a cliquear en ese globo y van a elegir el idioma español. Para poder escuchar esta transmisión en español, clique el globo, que van a ver ustedes el icono del globo, y ustedes van a poder escuchar esta junta virtual en español. Muchas gracias.
And hello and aware kai mono nzuti ero nahuba da wanyo cloni mono luta phalani owe grow mono ngaba belo we me we lo ni aware ngaba ti we le aware ngaba belo we Portuguese mo pheni kama nzuti ero kanaba da wanyo glu ni ke he thwera we pheni tia no tablo.
Welcoming us tonight, you all, is going to be Dr. Tony Dinkins. She is the Regional Superintendent of Milwaukee Public Schools. Dr. Dinkins.
Hi, and welcome to our final event, as Ms. Harris said, for our Black Lives Matter Week of Action. We are hopeful that you got a chance to enjoy all of the wonderful events this week. We kicked it off with a students Amplify panel. We went into a book study. We had our talent show. We enjoyed last night the intergenerational talk back. And then tonight we will enjoy an awards night and a book talk as well. Before I turn it over to Ryan Hurley, I do want to thank our superintendent, Dr. Keith Posley, for his support, and our board of school directors for their support, all of the committee members, Ms. Beal for chairing this up, and of course, our participants and our parents and community members who have visited, because we can plan the most wonderful events, but then if you all aren't involved, it doesn't make it as special. So thank you so much for everything that you have done for us this week and for being gracious participants. And without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Ryan Hurley. Have a wonderful night.
Hey, good evening. We want to first show respect and support for the indigenous nations on whose native land we are sitting, some of which include the Oseti Sakowin, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Peoria, Menominee, and Maiamia. We want to remind ourselves that genocide, broken treaties, and forced removals preceded our work here today, and that colonization is an ongoing and harmful process. We must commit to the spirit of anti-racism to inform ourselves about the history and present of indigenous nations and necessary work toward healing.
Hello, everyone. I will be your co-moderator. My name is Cindy Trujillo Tena, and I'm really excited to welcome everybody.
Happy Friday. Good evening. My name is Ryan Hurley. I'm with the Milwaukee Community Schools Partnership. Welcome to the final event in what has been an amazing Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action here in Milwaukee. While today is the final event for the Week of Action, I'd like to lift up the Black Lives Matter at School phrase of Week of Action, Year of Purpose, Lifetime of Learning. So before we end today, we're going to talk about some ways that we can all stay connected to this ongoing fight. I'm so honored to co-moderate this discussion today with three amazing individuals who have all played an instrumental role in the Black Lives Matter at School movement here in Milwaukee, in Philadelphia, and across the nation. I'm going to let each panelist introduce themselves, but before that happens, I just want to take a moment to celebrate the book that we are launching tonight, a book all three panelists had a role in. So Black Lives Matter at School, an uprising for educational justice, published by Haymarket Books, is a collection of essays, interviews, poems, resolutions, and more from educators, students, and activists who have been building the Black Lives Matter at School movement across the country. There's a lot of good endorsements, and I just want to read one from Ibram X. Kendi. The educators, students, and community activists whose stories are documented here are fighting for a transformative vision of what public schools can be. In the grassroots efforts, we will need to get there. Black Lives Matter at School is an essential resource for all those seeking to build an anti-racist school system. And if you're interested in learning more about the book, I think there should be a link in the chat at some point today. So can we welcome our panelists? Awesome. So again, I'd like to welcome Tamara, Ishmael, and Angela. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can we start by doing a quick round of introductions, who you are and what brought you to education activism?
I will start. Because everybody knows me. I'm Angela Harris. I'm a first grade teacher in Milwaukee Public Schools. I teach at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School, the African American Immersion School. I have been in the classroom. This will be my 4th year teaching, my 20th year overall, though, as an early childhood instructor. I think what really brought me to education activism work is really seeing how the system continually fails our Black students. I specifically took my job at Dr. King because I was working at a school prior to that where the students were very privileged. It was in Menominee Falls in Wisconsin, where they didn't have to worry about anything. And I came to my school, which happens to be right next door to one of the most incarcerated and divested zip codes. 53206, we're in 53212. And I saw how my children were being starved of resources that could help them be successful and help them achieve the greatness that I know exists in them. So it was important for me to begin to fight for the things that I felt like they deserved. So that's really what brought me to this work. I'll throw it over to Ish.
Peace, y'all. Always humble to speak. My name is Ishmael Jimenez, he, him, from Philadelphia. For the last 12 years, I've been a teacher in the school district of Philadelphia, teaching high school. I teach a required African-American history course that students need to graduate, which has been in place since 2005, which is part of the reason why I became a teacher in Philadelphia public schools to begin with. But for the most part, in Philadelphia, I was partly involved in helping start Black Lives Matter Week with Tamara and other folks. And, currently I'm a core member of BLM Philly and the Racial Justice Organizing Committee in Philadelphia that is doing our local Black Lives Matter Week planning. Pass it to Tamara then.
Hello. So I am advocate for children and teens, anti-racist trainer, professional artist, editor, freelance journalist, and blogger. I've been teaching for over 24 years in Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. I'm currently adjuncting at Westchester University in the Education Policy Department. I also supervise student teachers, pre-service teacher at LaSalle University, one of the founding steering committee members of the National Black Lives Matter Week of Back in School, a founding member of the Racial Justice Organizing Committee and Melanated Educators Collective, and of the Black Lives Matter Week of Schools in Philly, Opt Out Philly, and I'm currently a diversity consultant for the American Association of Physics Teachers. So what brings me to this work is that, I think all of my work pretty intersects along racial and social justice. I definitely started in Chicago by attending a very predominantly white high school, and just was one of the first classes that had started some kind of agitation around Black history and Black needs and Black and hiring of Black teachers at the school. And then that moves me forward into this life where I've always worked with, especially with adjudicated youth and those dropout teens, and the fact that, you know, how do we continue to push our children out of school, and what happens to them when they when they become adults, and, you know, and how that continues to fail them. And so this work, you know, helps me meet people like Angela and Ish to really do this work, you know, to make sure this work is not just happening in small places, but happening all over.
Awesome. So we can go right into our next question. And that question is, what does it mean to hold Black lives at the center of education? We can start with Ishmael.
I mean, like, number one, you gotta love Black lives. You gotta recognize, like, when we even talk about what that even means at the foundation of like education and purpose and meaning within our society, it takes us to a deeper understanding of like more than just surface level type of conversations. So when you center Black lives, you're centering a different narrative. You're sending, I would argue, a real American narrative that really reflects like the reality and the condition that folks have gone through, and the human condition, and solutions and theories that come out of those struggles against that inhumanity. And, you know, Black people in America are a perfect example in the largest empire the world has ever seen, at least within, you know, whatever we know as time, exist. And at the same time, another identity exists at the same time that is just as American, yet has a different storyline than what we are told or what we are indoctrinated with. And you know, that's what Black people have always represented in America. That's why it's always a threat. I always point out, like, you know, John Walker Lynn, who was found in Afghanistan, you know, fighting against American soldiers, who, you know, was from California, spent 17 years in prison for doing that. Yet we have MOVE members 40 years out, coming out of prison from those non-offenses for what they were involved in. So like this for me becomes stark. It becomes a stark reality that we need to acknowledge and be a part of, more than just like saying, oh, well, that's just like the arc of justice bends towards or whatever. I agree with that, but I think even Dr. King would articulate later on in his life that it's much more that, you know, we need to be very honest about the limitations of the society we live in. We need to recognize incremental change, but then at the same time push for a more radical agenda that recognize what is happening, what we're doing is not working. The issue then becomes, King said, I'm worried that we'll be dragged down the long, dark corridor of despair if we don't do anything, to paraphrase. And sometimes I worry sometimes that we didn't make that move at that point. But at the same time, that makes this even more urgent. And this is why we have to agitate and continue these type of conversations. And that's why centering Black lives changes the whole conversation, because you can't talk about justice for all or equality or anything if that wasn't defined by Black people within the nation that claimed it but didn't live it.
Thank you. Tamara?
Yes, yes, to all of that. Also, centering Black lives to me is just centering the truth, right? So if you want to center the truth, you have to center Black lives. That's why I always have to tell my students, especially if they're going to run off to these little alcoves of whiteness. So like, I don't have to do culturally relevant teaching because everybody looks like me. No, you do have to do culturally relevant teaching if you're going to tell the truth. If you're going to tell the truth about history, then we don't need to have Black Lives Matter Week of Action or 28 days in February. You're going to talk about how all of America is based upon brown and Black bodies. brown and black contributions on their art, on their writing, on their music, this would be a very dull and boring place if it were not for Black lives. It would not exist without Black lives. So for you to really center Black lives means you're actually centering the truth about manifest destiny. You're centering the truth about what Columbus really did. You're centering the truth about the transatlantic slave trade. You're centering the truth around who received reparations and who didn't. Because if one more person tells me, well, reparations are unfair, lots of former slave owners got reparations, got money, got land. This idea has been practiced since the American Revolution. Okay, even, you know, as far as Bacon Rebellion, which we don't talk about being this very diverse rebellion, right? And then those landowners were like, oh, wait a minute, we gotta get them something. Let's give them some land. Let's give the white women some seed and corn so they can hopefully marry each other and go off into the holy sunset and leave us alone, right? So that is basically the truth. And that is why I think, not just this is important, but this is why I think this very topic comes up every 10 years in our life. Because this is also not new. The reason why you read Baldwin now, even though 20 years ago people could not stand him, we have to talk about that too, right? So the reason why we read and respect, like, oh my goodness, it sounds like yesterday, the Miseducation Negro was still in my syllabus. It was written in the 1940s. It has everything to do with the fact that because every time we get to the point of change, it is violently pushed back. It is violently opposed to the point that then we have to take these little steps. So if one more person, if you come through this week, any day, and you come past the point where you saw people climbing over the walls of the Capitol, if that wasn't enough for you, then you need to actually ask yourself, then what do you truly think it means to be American? And if you truly think it means to be American for it to not include certain people, that is okay. But you need to say that out loud and with pride to all of your friends, including your Black ones, so they can know where you stand when they walk right on past you into a greater beginning. Because that is what it needs to be.
Thank you. And before we hand it over to Angela, I really appreciate you talking about centering the truth and really talking about what took place, right? Like who got reparations. I often hear people talk about Abraham Lincoln and the fact that he freed slaves, but nobody talks about the fact that he wanted them to go back to Africa. He didn't care about Black people. He didn't free anybody. It was all about money, you know? But we're not telling young people that. But it's not my place to speak. So Angela, I'll hand it over to you.
So, I mean, you know, everything that they said times two, you know, centering Black lives means telling the historically accurate truth about what this country is all about, right? Like, I think that all too often we hear this story, like slavery happened and then civil rights happened and we realized this post-racialized America where everything was great. And it's like, that's not really what happened and that's not the true story. And when we're teaching that to our children, that's how we continue to have these conversations. I use a Talk to Teachers by James Baldwin in professional developments all the time because it's still so relevant to what we're going through today. And I mean, like, ultimately for me, centering Black lives means allowing Black folks to show up how they want to show up too, right? Like, we are often so tone policed and there's a lot of respectability politics, especially when it comes to our children, right? We are never allowed to show up in spaces fully ourselves and fully whole. And so when we have spaces where Black lives are centered, that means that the righteous and the ratchet are allowed to show up in those spaces, right? And we're not saying you have to behave like this. There's a certain standard or, you know, a certain expectation for your behavior. We accept all of us, you know, because we aren't monolithic. We all believe and feel different things. We, you know, all listen to different types of music. So we need to be able to have spaces where we are truly centered for our authentic selves.
Yes to the righteous and the ratchet. I'm sorry, I had to unmute myself for that one. That's a bumper sticker. Can I make a shirt out of that? Because those are facts, but I'm gonna stay over here in my little cheap seat.
And I want to kind of let Angela have an opportunity to maybe build on that a little bit. So the next question is, what does it mean to humanize the experience of Black students? So can you talk a little bit more about kind of what that looks like in the classroom?
So when I ultimately, you know, when I think about this question, I think about like one of my first experiences on the playground. I was outside, the 7th and 8th graders were outside, and there was a young lady out there who was cussing up a storm. I mean, like every other word out of her mouth was a cuss word. And the teacher kept trying to like redirect her and get her to change her language. And she was like, "What the you mean? I'm just chilling with my friends." And I was like, honestly, she's not wrong, right? Like this is their time to talk to each other. And like the way that we have conversations with our students about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, and the spaces where they're allowed to be themselves versus the spaces where they aren't allowed to be themselves, and the reason and why is never explained to them, right? Like we never talk about why is it not appropriate to cuss at school, right? Like why isn't this an environment where it's inappropriate, you know? And we don't talk about like professional environments versus like our personal interactions and our personal environments. So when we're talking about allowing children to show up in spaces where they are fully themselves, that means that they can bring their trauma, they can bring, you know, whatever they want to bring in that space, and we're not going to judge them or penalize them for showing up like that. I think on Monday, you know, one of the student panelists talked about how she's constantly disrespected by teachers, but is expected to respect those same folks that disrespect her all the time. And so like, when do they get the respect that we ask them to give us, right? We shouldn't just expect respect because we hold this position of authority, because that's how we begin to perpetuate these systems of whiteness, right? Because we want to control our students and we want them to behave in a particular way and dress a certain way and speak a certain way, to the point where we begin to squelch their actual greatness and excellence because we're robbing them of all of the things that they actually are.
Thank you. Ishmael, would you mind, what does it mean to humanize the experience of Black students?
Well, the first thing, I'm very Ferrarian with it. You got to, it's, you know, education is a two-way street. It involves dialogue. It involves, you know, talking to folks, coming into a situation, not thinking that you know everything, that you're going to like enter your knowledge into empty vessels, but engage in a truthful conversation about life and what it means. And like, be intellectually honest about it. There are so many like layers to these conversations that it's even hard to even start a conversation. It's like, this is where we begin to heal. Because it's like, we're talking about something that has not even been reconciled at all as a society, let alone like honestly talked about amongst each other. You know, the first thing I would say is educate ourselves. You know, people knock on book clubs all the time, but I co-sign them. I think they are important. I think that the work like a group like Building White Anti-Racist Educators out of Philadelphia and other parts of Pennsylvania, I don't know what else they claim that they're out of, but out of primary Philadelphia, I think demonstrates like a group that seeks like for white educators to talk to each other about these issues. So like, you know, folks of color don't have to do all these, you know, the emotional labor, but then also then, you know, it doesn't mean that, you know, we don't have to engage in that emotional labor ourselves in an honest and truthful way. You know, the trauma that's involved to even talk about it sometimes. You know, I find myself tearing up when I just listen to songs sometimes. I don't know about y'all, I'm like, damn, just got myself. I don't know about y'all, but it gets real like that. And when we think about the gravity of that situation and what our children, with all the mirages and camouflages that exist within their existence nowadays, are faced with, we got to be honest about what we're dealing with and be honest with them. Because they can smell blood in the water, they can smell fakeness a mile away, they can, you know, and geniuses in their own right that are not considered such within our, you know, society or system, at least the students I have been teaching for a while. And it just becomes a point where it's like, yo, like you need to speak your truth in this reality, and not always is right, and you're not always the time to speak. Sometimes it's time to listen, but all those things together intertwine to help you better understand yourself and the world. And when you dialogue with that world on that level, you know, like when you say like, oh, that's big words. always say to them, you know, that's meant to keep you out of the conversation, right? You got to understand all them words, but at the same time, understand how them words can be manipulated towards your benefit, you know, in order to better change the world for a better future and wiser in pursuing them goals. So that, I mean, that's what it means to dialogue with them, you know, to be more than somebody telling them what it is, but telling students like, these are the tools you need to challenge what you think it is, let alone what you're told it is, let alone what I think it is. Not to go too abstract with it, you know. Obviously.
Absolutely. No, I mean, students know, right? Students know. And I'm seeing people repeat that in the chat, right? Students see that, they see you. Tamara, would you mind answering that question as well?
Sure. I mean, I always think this, you know, this goes on the principle of intergenerational, right? I think what happens, whether you're a parent or not, I think teachers of all hues, because I don't want to point no fingers, because all skin folks ain't your kin folks, is that I find that we forget what it means to build radical relationships with our children. And another reason why it's hard is because we don't treat them like children. We try to adultificate them so quickly into what they should and should not do. Now, there is a reason for that. There's a history behind that. Having your children to be silent saved their lives in the 50s and the 60s. Shoot, now, today, it would save their life. They do not have a lot of wiggle room to be children in the real world. So a lot of times we see this tough love happens because the adults know that. So we also have to have some empathy and grace when we do see it interact out on the playground or in the classroom. And sometimes we have to hold up our peers and our elders and be like, ooh, I know that they had an out-of-body experience, and I know that you're about to jump up and down inside of their whole spirit. I said, so let me take them out to class for a second. This is also about building community and villages, right? It's okay to say that I cannot take this today. We all have had that student. I'm having a memory now, flashbacks, eye twitching. Like, we've all had that one student where I was like, I need you to go next door. Just talk to them for 2 seconds, okay, and then come back. But I'm gonna tell you what my students always knew. They always knew that when they came back, it'd be welcome. They always knew, like, whew, okay, Miss Anderson, I know I jumped on your last nerve, but let me tell you why. If you can get to that communication, you have built a radical relationship. When they've had an out-of-body experience, cuss you stone cold out, and then come back an hour later and are like, it's because I got locked out this morning. I didn't have no breakfast. I didn't have this. And when I try to come to your class, because I know you always have snacks in your drawer, the man in the hallway stopped me. Do you see what I'm saying? So there's all types of things that happen because the students know who are caring and who are generous. We also, you can humanize children and relationships by stop taking things so seriously all the time. Your life, I mean, this is a kid, it's a child. At the end of the world, it's a child. Breathe, count to 20. I'm sure you got about 4 bills at home that you want to curse out. So think about that and stop worrying about these children. Secondly, going back to educating yourself, making sure that we all have really great therapy and access to culturally relevant therapy. I'm gonna say it again for the cheap seats. If you are in a caring position, like teaching, nursing, social work, and you are not seeing somebody, you are not in telehealth right now, I am concerned for your spirit and your soul, because that is a part of healing. If you read Grandmother's Hands, he doesn't just tell you to walk through the gray pages and hope for the best. He says in the first 5 pages, I recommend professional counsel, because this work is soul-changing work. It actually mentally and on a cellular level affects how your cerebral cortex functions and is wired because of the sheer stress of it. So imagine that in a child coming to you every day. Because understand, the fact of them seeing the bear and the bear making you run or the bear making you fight, sometimes the bears are in their houses every day and on the street corners every day. And then they're coming to you looking for refuge. They're looking for calm. They're looking for peace. And sometimes it doesn't come out always articulate. It doesn't always come out normalized, and it doesn't always come out nice. But you have to see past your own stuff to see where their stuff is coming from. And you also have to be healthy enough to recognize that you still have some work to do. It's okay to tell your students, you know what, Miss Anderson's not having a good day today. I'm really sorry I snapped at you today. But if you say one more thing, I might snap again. So give me about 5-10 minutes to breathe and drink this Diet Pepsi Cola and get my sugar right. And then we can talk about it, okay? Because they will appreciate that. It's about being honest. It's the same thing. It's so funny. It's the same thing all of us wanted from our own parents. Just think back, even if you don't have no kids. Remember how your parents didn't listen to you. Remember how your mom got on your nerves. Remember that when you are trying to build radical relationships. You know, some people are like, well, I'm not their friend, but you can be friendly, you can be kind, and you can be loving. And let me tell you, those are the ones that will stop in the hallway. You know, when I used to walk down the hallway, the school had 1,800 students. They ain't listen to the principal. But if they saw my little brown self rolling around the corner, they're like, oh my God, this stop. What? What y'all doing? What happened? So that means that you can walk with grace and empathy and still carry a very firm stick. So all that stuff you learned in your class management classes, forget about it. Pick you up some Goldie Muhammad, pick you up some James Baldwin, pick you up some Lisa Delpit. Please pick you up all of Bell Hooks and Gloria Lads and Billings. Listen to these Black women who we continue to push to the outskirts of education. Because I'm telling you, if one more education program I work for tells me they don't teach that anymore, that's a whole story for another time. It's another discussion. You need to grab onto those Black women and those philosophies and use those in your classroom. And that's all I got. I'm sorry, I went on a tangent.
No,
No, I really appreciate, sorry, Ryan. I really appreciated that tangent. Radical relationships, you all build them radical relationships with your students. Don't be afraid. And I think, you know, this just really made me think of something what Tamara was saying. We have to be able to humanize ourselves too, right? I think that that's part of the, like, go to a therapist, get some counseling, deal with your stuff, so you're not bringing that into the classroom spaces when you're dealing with these students, right? And I think a lot of it is like, because as teachers, we hold ourselves to this standard sometimes of like perfectionism. And so we're afraid to show our students that we are human and that we make mistakes and we can apologize and we can be wrong, you know, like, so I just felt all of that. So I had to say something.
Thank you. No, I was just going to say, like, it reminded me a lot of restorative practices, right? Like high accountability, high support, right? Our schools are often high accountability, low support, but this idea of radical relationships, just like I hear, like it resonates with me because I think about restorative practices. So thank you for that.
I'm like processing everything that was said because these are my typical Friday afternoon conversations. But thank you. Super deep, super relevant to a lot of conversations I've had this week. Very real. Now let's talk a little bit about how do you see Black Lives Matter at school being connected to the legacy of Black liberation education? And can we start with Angela?
Man, how do I see Black Lives Matter at school being connected to Black liberatory education? So I think Black Lives Matter at school is Black liberatory education, like happening in real present time, right? Like if it's being done the right way, you are creating spaces where you are liberating the minds of not just the Black and brown children that you're teaching, but the white children that you're teaching as well, the children who are not, you know, children of color. So I feel like this is something that is, I talk about this all the time, planting the seeds for the future, right? So we won't have to talk about, you know, oh, Mrs. Harris, she was a radical, you know, liberatory educator and she taught her children XYZ. Like that'll be the praxis of every teacher that walks into the school building, hopefully hopefully in the future. I know we talked about earlier how we keep having these same conversations every 10 years, but I feel like honestly, we created, I think the National Steering Committee created a movement that, like Tamara said earlier, isn't silo. It's happening across the country in various states. And so these seeds are being planted, not just here in Milwaukee, not in Philadelphia, but everywhere. So it's students that are getting this information and they're learning about folks like Bell Hooks and learning about Goldie Muhammad, and they're learning about Assata Shakur, and they're learning about Asa Hilliard, and they're learning about the liberatory educators of the past, and 19th century literary spaces where it was affinity spaces and they were all Black and folks were distinguished and educated. So like all of that is happening right now, and hopefully, is planting the seeds for the future.
Thank you. How about we go with Tamara?
Everything that Angela just said, and times two. I mean, I know for a fact that this curriculum, because we also have created something for younger children that they are often forgotten, or elementary, pre-K. We also have created this language, because I hear that a lot. Well, they're too young to talk about that. And where that happen at? Because they're not too young to get little handcuffs put on them when we see that the most people suspended are 3 and 4 year olds in preschool. I'm gonna say that again. Statistically, according to Dr. Morris, they're 3 to 4 year old. We are suspending 3 to 4 year olds. Yes. So since they're not too young for that, they're not too young to get killed like Tamir Rice, but just playing in a playground. We have to talk about this. It is imperative, and not just with children who look brown and Black, who fit whatever, all of our children, right? So I think that this Black Lives Matter Week in schools has created an imperative. Let's say that. It's created a new imperative to actually, for the first time in a long time, connect the past to the present. So now we're looking at Septima Clark, we're looking at Ella Baker, we're looking at these primary sources and looking at how does that look like for curriculum today. We're looking at those literary societies that Angela spoke about and saying, well, how do we create, what do book clubs look like? Because that's what a book club is. What do these book clubs, these conversations look like? How do we uplift the words of Zerlina Hurston when she wrote a letter to the Orlando Sentinel and challenged the Brown vs. Board education decision in real language? Like we always are talking about, well, the top 5 things of seeing races in society is segregation. Nobody says that's because you always practice one way integration and not reciprocal integration. You cannot fix segregation if you are still centering whiteness as the goal for what we should all have for integration. I'm going to say that for the chief seats, because I know that connects. We also talk about the 30,000 teachers that lost their jobs as a Brown vs. Board of Education. So we have to talk about the good and the bad of the very things that have brought us to today. The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment completely changed the Constitution. Changed it so much that you had the highest number of African Americans participating in public office, higher than ever, even today. But it was so radical that we had to basically make those same 3 laws again in 1964, 65, 68. So what does that say about the country? It says that it violently, once again, I'll say it again, it does not want this. So if something that I find that when somebody doesn't think about your own personal success, how many of us have been going along and things are going really great, and then all these naysayers jump out the woodwork trying to stop you? You know why? Because you're doing something great. You're doing something important. You're doing something that can change. This work says the same thing. Anytime this work gets to a certain thing, we get more threatening letters. We get more nasty emails. We get more nasty comments on our Facebook page. We get more people telling us, well, all lives matter. Okay, all this stuff happened because you headed for something great. You also are headed towards something that can monumentally transform people from the inside out. And I don't know about you, but that's scary, not just for other people, but every people. Because change means you have to, on a cellular level, make a decision to wake up and do something different. And we know that building and developing new habits isn't easy. and it won't come like, a snap of our finger. And every principal, every week, every day that we learn about this curriculum, you are changing somebody, even if it's one person at a time, which means they're going back into their houses and they're making change happen. Because that is really how this work goes. When people are like, how do we change all these problems? You're not going to do that. Who are you? You got an S on your chest? That's not your job. You need to change one person at a time and send that one person marching into the other people who are crazy. They can talk to them and change their lives one person at a time. That's what I think like this work means.
Thank you, thank you. Ishmael?
It's always hard going after like such a prolificness of folks. As someone who has myself has like personally contemplated my whole life about, how to go into this, issue. Not even just issue, but just like, how we deal with our existence. It just brings like something deeper in the sense of me when I'm thinking about like as an educator, as a parent of students in the school district in which I teach, as someone who just is involved in activism, I would say more than I should be. That's just based on my limitation of time, not my desire. It becomes all empowering and all encompassing to, just recognize the time. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a reflection of our time. We're seeing that like wave of like, we either pick something up and then the energy's scattered, or the energy just dissipates. And it becomes like the status quo in which it exists, just in a different form. Maybe it has like a smiley face on it this time. I don't know what it looks like. But that becomes our existence. It becomes this continuous wave. And that's what this means to me. We're like at another moment, like, nah, it's like, we're going to control this narrative. Not only control this narrative, but we're going to tell this story through a lens that centers the most marginalized folks within that narrative. Centering Black people and all Black people, regardless of, their ability or their sexual orientation or, their identity, all those things are still tied to being Black and being marginalized within this society, and everything being pushed aside from jump ever. It's always been like that within this society. And if one group puts one above another, and, within it, that's the divide and conquer strategy always that has existed. And that strength of like a unified force, which we even see in local elections, like in Alabama for Senator Doug Jones a while ago, that dude, like Black woman elected dude, like that always happens. Like you always point, that's like solidarity vote, 98%, 96% in certain areas like that. Where does that exist for any other group? And, when we talk about Black people, that type of solidarity is real. But like, that's what we're seeing as an outgrowth of this. And hopefully we're learning from our mistakes. So like, I know at Black Lives Matter Week, that's why we have an all Black national steering committee. Not that we control anybody, but we want to make sure that it's handled with fidelity, and you're not like saying like, here, we're practicing slave rituals on one day and calling it something, I don't know, I couldn't even imagine. But people feel what I'm saying. And that's just the reality of what it is. Like, folks don't really know, but that's also a detriment of unfortunately, a lot of folks have been indoctrinated, been taught, and been fed their whole lives. So just thinking about that reality and being very clear is very important.
Thank you.
And I think, one second, Cindy, just to hop in again. I think that the good thing about the National Steering Committee is we hold that space. Like, we don't like we hold that space. We don't allow anybody to come in and say, like, this is what you all are gonna do, or here, we'll give you support and money if you sign on to this campaign. We are very intentional about holding that space, holding it with one another, having conversations with one another, and like really trying to work through this the right way. I think that is a perfect example of beloved community and working as a collective, right? Like, because even when we have disagreements, we're like, okay, cool, let's talk about this. Let's figure out how we can make this work and move forward so we can keep this work pushing. And I think like that's another way that we are going to, I think hold a stake in Black liberatory education work, because it'll be an example for other folks. We don't even live in the same state. I've only seen Ish in person one time, and I've never met Tamara in person in my life, but we still hold each other in such high regard, and we're there for each other, when we need each other, and we're ready to do this work.
It's a perfect transition to the next question. So, so what are the opportunities for connecting different elements of the struggle for education liberation with the demands for Black Lives Matter at school? So the Counselors Not Cops, Black and Ethnic Studies, hiring more Black teachers, and restorative justice for all. Angela, you want to take that one?
Can somebody else go first? Ask the question again, Ryan. I'll go. Okay, ask me one more time.
Sure. What are opportunities for connecting different elements of the struggle for education liberation with the demands for Black Lives Matter at school?
Oh, so like a perfect example is what, the Equity Coalition was able to do here in Milwaukee, right? Building coalition with Leaders Igniting Transformation and MICAH and Black Educators Caucus, and then really rallying against any type of policing, any form of policing in our districts, right? Starting with the Adani contracts, right? When they were trying to bring the airport style security metal detectors in our school buildings and upgrading all of the metal detectors, and upgrading these contracts, like starting with that fight there, and then, pushing towards totally police-free schools, right? And so that built up to, the SRO contract, and really talking about the relationship between Milwaukee Police Department and Milwaukee Public Schools, and how that, not only facilitates the fuels and facilitates the school to prison pipeline, but really thinking about how it makes our students feel, and I think that it was so impactful really hearing from students about how they feel going into school buildings and feeling policed, and how the buildings look like prisons and look like jails and don't feel welcoming. So like that is a perfect example of taking what needs to be fixed in education spaces and connecting it with the national demands for the Black Lives Matter movement at schools. When we talk about, end zero tolerance, which is the actual national demand, end zero tolerance, we changed it here to restorative justice for all. But when we talk about like the end zero tolerance policies, what we're really talking about is ending punitive discipline practices in school districts, right? We're talking about creating environments where they are restorative, where children have an opportunity to come back to school and repair not even leave school, but stay in school and repair the harm that they caused, and still get their education and still be seen as a valued member of the school community. And so like, we have to begin to think about these words that we use. When we talk about hire more Black teachers, there's a reason why we say that, because we know that children are more successful when they have Black teachers in front of them. And not just Black children, you all, don't get it twisted. White children are more successful when they have Black teachers in front of them too. And when we talk about, we already talked about Counselors Not Cops, and we talked about restorative justice. We talked about end zero tolerance. I think I hit them all. I think that we see that this education system was not built for Black and brown children. We see the ways that it harms them, and it continues to cause trauma. It manifests trauma within our students. And so these national demands were built by students, because they recognized all of the things that were happening to them in their school spaces. And so when we talk about creating, educational spaces where Black children are liberated, it really means addressing and realizing these national demands.
Well, just needed to say that.
Ishmael, Tamara, what would either of you like to expand on it?
You want to go, Ish, or you want me to go? He's like, go. Okay. So I'm going to go backward. I'm going to say that also, oh yes, trauma and spirit murder. Whew, don't even get it started. Okay, I want to sing a Negro spiritual in this room. So here we go. So I think that one thing that really, that what happened in Philly, I'd like to bring it kind of like really close home, is that we built an anti-racist training. And one of the things we built it is because we didn't trust the district to build it. We're like, do we make it a demand and tell the district to make one for us? But then we're like, look at what the district has done so far. No, so that's a 0. So we got together, and I mean, people are bringing in articles and ideas. Do we make it intersectional? What about this? All this shit. So months later, all of a sudden we had 20 hours worth of material that include like a really clear Black feminist queer lens. It really includes a real articulation of white supremacy, a real articulation of like, what does that look like in your schools? You know, bringing in abolitionist education and teaching, thanks to Dr. Bettina Love, speaking about what that looks like, having, for example, we just did a training in Maine Monday, one half of a training, and something that I had no idea, I was Monday old when I heard about it, was digital blackface. This is a thing that is happening in Maine schools, where students are using either Black famous people or Black people to be their like emoji or their picture on their Zoom screen. So it's like, what does that mean? Where does that come from? And so it's all this history and you talk about it and things like that. But I think also even with the councils not cops, that's always been a very divisive issue. You know, teachers may not ever say this out loud in the common streets, but it's a very divisive issue because some of our schools are very volatile and they don't have the support. And you're like, so when this child, I have teachers who have gotten glass picked out of their eyes because a student broke a window. Like things have happened in schools, right? To all of us. But the bigger question is, what do the cops do when they're there? What do the cops do in actual life? Because we like to say, oh, what about if my sister was raped? She'll be raped. Those cases go very highly unsolved. Well, what if somebody gets shot? Yep, not a big high priority either. That's not just in Philly, that's Chicago, New York, pick a city. You know, the very reasons why we want them to be there are reasons that we don't get the service either. So the thing is that we do know that we need, Philadelphia has 1.9 million residents, and we have 2 emergency mental health trucks to go out and help people. So when I have a student that has cut herself and I got to sit there and wait for that truck, many a times I had to throw that child in the backseat of my car and take her to the hospital and call her parents on the way. Because I waited for hours because it's 4 of them that work in the entire city. So we need to look at that. When we're talking about ethnic and African studies, we need to talk about why am I teaching students in 2020 who have never read Howard Zinn's People's History? Where does that happen at? It's a book. He was giving them out for free before he died. He was like, here you go. We just give them to every school. So how did you miss that? How do I have schools that have no idea what the Highland Center or that comes from Highland Folk Center, or that just don't know any of the history, never seen a literacy test that people had to take in the South, don't know what that looks like? How are we missing on primary sources that Smithsonian gives you for free, including the original crisis, the original like newsletters that ought to be well typed are accessible for free on the database? How is it these things are not getting out to people, getting out to teachers, so kids can see them and feel them and look at their history and really be like, oh, wow, because it connects to this. If we're only talking about the founding fathers, we are not even telling a half story. We are telling a quarter, a third, a drop of the story. Like, does anybody know that during the American Revolution, it was actually racially the most diverse the colonies were during that time? Like some of the colonies had higher African representation than we see now. Wink, wink. So the thing is that you need to have these demands really just make us accountable. They're not rules. They should honestly be common sense things that all of us have tried to achieve. Here, for example, they used to never even measure the demographics of teachers and then tell us they want to hire more Black teachers. I said, that's weird. That's like saying you want to make more money, but you don't ever check your bank account. How do you know where you started from to know where you got to go? So then they finally, gave us the numbers. They were horrific. It's 24%. So last year they hired more Black teachers. You know where it went to? 24%, which means those teachers didn't stay. So now you got to ask yourself, where are they going? Because we got all these ideas, they don't pay you enough money and da-da-da. That's true. But most Black teachers don't leave because of the kids, and they don't leave because of the system. They leave because they're not supported, and wink, wink, they can, get a better job someplace else, that too. And how is it we got 20% Black teachers, but we have 40, 50% Black principals? So somebody used to be a teacher and decided to go be a principal. So we're losing people. We're losing people way back in kindergarten when we know that most of them drop out and don't finish 10th grade, but we don't talk about that either. We keep trying to throw scholarships at invisible Black children who are not even ready to go to college in the first place, instead of us starting way back in kindergarten to figure out why nobody wants to go teach in the first place. So it's about taking these demands and looking at real manifestations, looking at real systemic issues and dealing with them, not just nationally, but in your own community. That's what these demands help you do.
Thank you, and I'm so glad you brought up the fight for anti-racist training. I have a lot of follow-up questions for you on that, because reading your chapter, I saw a lot of parallels to some of the work that you're doing in Philly to here in Milwaukee. So, but I first want to give Ishmael opportunity to answer this question as well.
One of the things when we were discussing the demands, I remember, was a call for ethnic studies. And there were some calls for ethnic studies in some places, like it was on the verge, and folks wanted to make a demand. And in Philadelphia, I was like, yo, we have a mandatory, Black history curriculum. We don't necessarily want to call for like ethnic studies. And that's even where the anti-racist demand comes from. Because we, out of our already existing African-American history required course, there is nothing else to fight for. Ethnic studies, a good African-American history course actually covers that, in my opinion. But overall, it just connects to the overall picture of trying to connect how the story in America in this context and its like spectrum of identity has always worked as like an extreme of whiteness on one side, Blackness on the other side, with folks in between that fit within that narrative, but identify with the extremes. And when I say extremes, I'm talking about the extremes our society places upon those definitions. And this is from a book called Whitewashing Race. So then it becomes like people who are more able to fit in and assimilate to, the society, white American society, more easily fit into that mold. And people of color who don't fail to operate economically in the same type of way becomes a real reality, still perpetuating systems and structures that have always existed of racialized exploitation that this society is built upon. And so like, for me, the values of focusing on like ethnic studies or Black history goes back again to what I was emphasizing before, is a counter narrative. A story that goes against the story or mythology that is usually like, pumped to our children. Like our children are literally indoctrinated with mythologies of, grandeur greatness and exceptionalism, like they're invincible to kind of the, you know, the setup for conflicts and other type of things that have been like perpetuated by, you know, our ancestors collectively. But especially, you know, talking about, you know, folks fighting over desired resources since transatlantic slave trade. So like when we're talking about all that reality and we connect that all together, for me, that value sticks out the most, because I remember even having explicitly that conversation. Even the fact that Black Lives Matter Week would fall in February, asking the question, would that take away the focus away from Black History Month? So even the first week that we did in Philadelphia was in January, the last week in January, leading into Black History Month. But we switched it up to align with people's testing schedule in different places, or, you know, when people are off, because we didn't want to interrupt that. And that's why I ended back up in February. So it's just like those like nuances of history, because I'm a history nerd. I love it. But at the same time, I think it tells a deeper story about like the values and the deeper stories behind even how we got to even just one.
Thank you. So our last official question before we turn it over to the Q&A is, what actions do you want folks to take in order to strengthen this work and amplify Black voices? And we can start with Angela.
So I'm going to start at the back, the end of the question first, amplify Black voices part. So I'm going to start with this statement: believe Black people, like believe us. When we say something is happening, when we are talking to you about our experiences, believe Black people, like believe us, like just believe Black people. And if you are a person who's doing anti-racist work, or a person who claims to be an ally or a co-conspirator, step out of the way. Like, that's how you can amplify Black voices. Find the Black person that's doing the work for free and push them into the spot that you're in. Give up your role as the director of equity of such and such. Give it to somebody Black. Let somebody Black do it, okay? If you work in the Office of Equity, Equity and Inclusion, give that job to someone Black, right? Like, make space for Black people. That's how we amplify Black folks' voices. We make space for them, and we put them in the roles that they aren't traditionally in. We give them seats at tables that they aren't traditionally allowed to sit at. That's how you amplify Black voices. And you know, the first part of the question, like, do some work. Anti-racism work is self-work. Like, so and I'm not talking about like picking up Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility book. That's not what I'm saying when I say do the work. I mean, actually engage with folks that you wouldn't normally engage with. Leave your bubble, have conversations with people who are going to make you feel uncomfortable, like myself, Tamara, and Ishmael, and tell you the truth about what really is going on here in America and the history of our country. And then maybe pick up Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility book. You know, and then after you do all of that, create a plan. Like, how are you going to keep the work going? Like, don't go to Thanksgiving dinner and let your uncle say something wild about Black people at the dinner table, and you don't correct that and you don't stand up for that. Because like, if you can't do it in the spaces, in your spheres of influence, there's no way that you're going to be able to do it anywhere else. So like, that's always what I say. Like, amplify Black voices, make space for Black folks, particularly Black women. Do some work, your own personal work, and then handle it in your spheres of influence.
Thank you for that. I think I don't want to go into details, but I do see that happening a lot, right? Where people want to be the ones advocating and fighting for this and whatnot, but they want to be the face of that when they're not even Black. It's like, no. What are you doing? But anyway, let's hand it over to Tamara.
I am dying over here. My face, I cannot. So it's so funny. So Angela, I have never met. but we have the greatest fun in these Zoom spaces all the time. So I think if we met each other face to face, we would never let each other go. I would never come back to Philly. Okay.
No,
So
I would never leave. I would never leave Philly. I would be like, I'm staying. I'm gonna start using John. That's gonna be my word.
literally. Oh my goodness. I think it's everything Angela said, and even more, like if you really about doing this work, stop calling yourself a DEI person. You can't achieve diversity, equity, and inclusion unless you're gonna say racism and white supremacy and white savagery or white terrorism. You can't say those words 3 times fast, then please don't use DEI. It almost makes my skin go inside and out. It's like when we offer anti-racist training, we've had schools to be like, can you say, bias? I was like, we talk about that in there. Now, you done gave us this contract. You either want us to come or you don't. I mean, it's just a Zoom link. I could go back to bed. And so I also think too, we also amplifying Black voices, and also recognize when you have to start off with this thing of tokenism. Because sometimes you don't know no Black person. I get that. That happens in this life. So you might have to tokenize a little and pick you up your top 5 Black people to amplify. This is how you move it. This is how you transform it from tokenism to real work. Once you get these 5 Black people, and these 5 Black people recommend some more Black people, you don't shut the door. And I got another hint for you. Find you some, I always wonder how in predominantly white, like white unions or white caucuses, we ask teachers to bring people of color, they don't bring nobody. You ain't got no Black friends at your school? So you talking about making change and being social justice and blah, blah, blah. But you can't grab nobody who don't look like you to bring to this meeting. Because all the Black people can't bring their Black friends. So let me tell you what happened. Then those Black friends start cussing us out at home. Why you bring me to that crazy meeting when nobody was talking about nothing and I ain't never coming back? And then they don't come back. And then the white people in charge are like, I don't know what happened. I thought we were very open. No, you have to make it so that you got to bring people in too. Where your friends at? That's, so the whole thing is you have to make sure that's how you move. People like get really guilty. Like, well, I mean, I did pick some of the pairs because, tokenism. It's okay, baby. You don't have no Black friends. Now you do. What is your next move? Your next move now is to open up the gate to other people. Widen your breath. Don't just talk about this work as y'all at school or in a book club. If you're not building real personal relationships with people of color, I'm gonna say that for the cheap seat. You're not building real personal relationships with people of color. And you get on Facebook and you throw up a flag and you throw up a fist and you say you support Black Lives Matter, you are not N-O-T with the double T-T like they say in the Midwest. You are not doing the work at all. And that's all I got to say on it.
That was too real. That was too real. And I've seen it happen so many times. So I'm glad you named that and called people out on that because I need to hear that. Ishmael.
I never know where to start after talking that tomorrow, right? Should I build upon it? Should I talk about something new? It's an ongoing conversation.
Go and build on it. You know those stories. We got those stories together. They'll be like, let's pick our 2 favorite Black people to talk about the one Black topic. I'm like, you got no Black friends? Or your Black friends?
I mean, it's hard work in the sense of even having those conversations. I don't know. I don't even know where to begin with that. I know it's traumatizing for me. From a very young age, I experienced very traumatizing experiences from teachers, from fellow schoolmates, around lip size, around know, being called a burnt French fry where I'm not even dark or anything like that. You know what I mean? Like stuff like that at a young age. But that definitely informed my experience and my understanding of how to understand my experience at a young age. So ultimately, I would say that the best way to approach it is to be real. Like too many people are trying to be like, oh, too, you know, correct, too right, too woke, too mixed, too, you know what I mean? Like it becomes not a conversation no more, or ever. And I guess that's another point of it. To start a conversation that we never really even had before, and honestly, which we never really speak to each other about. So I guess I'm creating barriers when I'm talking about it. But ultimately, I think that it shows our disconnect with one another, our ability to understand where other folks are coming from and how to be honest with one another about those issues that influence how we perceive the world and how the world perceives us. You know, ultimately and honestly, we have no control of that. We're all born into this FRE. I'm trying not to cuss. You know, this nonsense is what it is. We have no control over what it is and how it manifests itself. But at the same time, we do can influence while we're here what it is and what it might become. Being clear about that becomes a more difficult story about like how to go about doing those things. And things like BLM week and these type of conversations and larger conversations that hopefully these things lead to get to that point that like obviously what we're doing is not working right now. What does it mean to do what could work? And how can we be honest with one another about like what has created what we currently exist within? And I think for me, those are the deeper questions, conversations, challenges, and analysis that we need from our best and brightest going forward. And just teaching our children that, how to critically think about that, how to ask those types of questions, how to challenge themselves to start the questioning of those questions and why they should be asked in the first place, I believe is heavy within itself.
Thank you for that. I believe David was collecting the questions from the chat. But there is one in the Q&A that says, it's from Sarah. I don't know how to pronounce your last name, so I'd rather not butcher it. But it says, Miss Harris said she works at an African-American immersion school. Will you please explain what African-American immersion means?
I would love to explain what African-American immersion means. Essentially, African-American Immersion School is a school where Black students in particular, but all students who enter our building are immersed in their culture, our culture, from the time they enter the building until they leave at the end of the day. So it's in the language that we use with our students. So if I'm trying to get my students' attention, I say, I go, that means I need your attention. They say, I may, that means I'm ready to give you my attention. We have Mbongi, which is our morning meetings. So it's in everything we do. It's embedded in our culture. So when I'm teaching math, I'm not just teaching math. I'm teaching math that is culturally relevant and culturally reflective, and teaching them about mathematicians, Black mathematicians of the past and Black mathematicians today. It is in the way that we treat them. So when we talk about beloved community, that is an expectation that we hold in our school. We have a dignity framework for the way that we interact, not only with our students, but with each other as adults as well. So, you know, Dr. King was an African-American immersion school in the 90s, and it was a very successful school in the 90s. So the student population was exactly the same as it is now. So we have families that were 90% Title I families. So 90% of the families at the school receive some sort of state assistance. And we had 90% of the school, 90% of the kids at the school were from the neighborhood. So they were actually from the 53212 area. And so they were able to create an environment where those students were excelling. And there was also a pipeline program. So Dr. King fed into Malcolm X Academy so they could continue at the African American immersion style learning. It's really modeled after what would be considered a freedom school, right? So there's freedom schools in Philadelphia where they are teaching children, you know, about the culture and teaching in a non-traditional way. I think that, you know, it's difficult for Dr. King to be recognized sometimes as an African American immersion school because people don't understand cultural immersion. They're like, so what language do you speak at your school? And I'm like, listen, do you know how many languages they speak in Africa? Like, how could we pick just one? Like, how could we honestly pick one language to teach them? And so like, it's really about embracing the fact that Black children learn differently. And so this is a space where we are providing them an opportunity to be taught the way that they learn.
So I had a question for Tamara. So in your book, you talk about the fight for anti-racist professional development. But you also talk about the fight for the need to ensure that the community had voice, had control over what that professional development became. And I just wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about why you felt that was important, instead of just, you know, being able to, instead of just celebrating that win, keeping the pressure on, I guess, to again ensure that the community was a key part and it wasn't just something that was top down.
Yeah, so because, you know, because I wear multiple hats, because I'm in the classroom now, you know, I'm working with teachers now in the classroom, and I have a child. For me, you know, my activism always started off as community activism. I believe that a school is only as strong as the community around it. I have worked at some of the quote unquote lowest schools in the city, but I knew that my car was going to be okay and I would get dinner every Friday if I stayed late, or grandma would come over and help me out with one of the kids. Like, the community is very important. I worked at one of the early community schools in Chicago. We actually had a clinic at our school in the back, things like that. So it's one of the reasons why I love the fact that Black Lives Matter at school is also Black Lives Matter Week of Action. But I think sometimes when parents hear school, they're like, oh, that's not for me. I always want parents and the community organizers, people to feel like this is for me, no matter where you are. And so one of the things that was really important is when we sat down to do the anti-racist training was to make sure it was an open process. So even if you missed a meeting, there was an open Google Doc that was public, where all of our meetings, everything we talked about, if you wanted to drop in a PowerPoint presentation, you had some ideas, it was an ongoing thing. It was constant until it got to a point, you know, of course, we had to pull some stuff together, but there's not one person that ever felt like they weren't heard or that their idea wasn't considered. And even now, we've just got to the point where we have trained more trainers. So they have brought some insight and some improvement into the process. So, and what's interesting is even though the school district is not like, this is your official training, we have done lots of like under the radar trainings that people's principals have asked us to come and do it, right? Like the word of mouth is kind of growing. Like the fact that we actually did a training for Baltimore Teachers Union, but we also talk about how racism looks in unions, how it looks in caucuses. We did one for AFSCME, like for the Philadelphia Museum of Art. They had a question about, you know, how do we create a racial justice caucus or racial justice group? Even the Debt Collective, which acknowledges that, you know, it's like a predominantly white group here in Philadelphia, is very purposeful in like, how do we do this work and make sure that we are very purposeful in how we recruit people of color, which I love. I love purposefulness, you know what I'm saying? Because what I find is that as they get more members of color, those members stay because they feel cultivated, they feel heard, They feel empowered to bring other people into the work. They feel like this is a shared community, you know, understanding how debt, those types of things. I know I'm getting on tangent, but that is one of the things, and even having different versions of the training. We used to be like, these are 20 hours. Now we have like PD versions of the training, where maybe this training is only about how do you build an anti-racist lens in your class? What does that look like? You know, or even something as simple as, what about intersectionality? We talk about ableism, and we use the gender unicorn, and we talk about all these different things for bias and ableism. And what does that look like? What does it mean to have students and non-binary students and trans students, LGBTQ plus students in your community and in your staff? What type of literature and books should be read? How do you have these conversations with not only middle school and high school children, but with pre-K and elementary? We also have constant feedback and surveys. So like we're actually having a meeting coming up to review those, to talk about where we need to make changes, where things need to go, who should we talk to give us, like I'm all about, especially including indigenous populations, like looking at those histories and really looking at those histories in a robust way, in a nuanced way, because they are also not monolithic. We have a tendency to kind of throw their history into like ethnic studies and say, good luck, Buttercup, but that's not really how that works, right? If we really want to be purposeful, we have to show the nuances and understand. You know, I have had teachers not understand why a child from Dominica and a child from Puerto Rico were having a fight. They're like, oh, they're the same. Okay, where they're written at? I was like, they're not the same. They having a fight, and depending on, you know, how long have they been here? Like, you don't know how recent the beef is and what it's about, and is it cultural and what's happening. So these type of conversations, there's sometimes we have stopped the training dead in the middle. And I think also because now we're virtual, as much as people like virtual so terrible, one thing I would say about virtual is it is more accessible. You know, those individuals who need some assistance, and, you know, they're coming in, but it also allows us to have these conversations with teachers in Maine and Baltimore and Chicago and other places without having to really leave, but also realizing that looking at their demographics, you know, what does culturally relevant teaching mean in a city that is 90% white? That does have a 5% Black population, did start a Black student union, but what does that mean for them? You know, really, you know, having a really nuanced and robust and challenging conversation. So that is why it was important to have check-ins so that we could also be held accountable. I find that when people start having secret meetings, they don't realize, they think they're doing good work, and they might, but what you're doing is you're creating animosity within the group. Because then it becomes like, this is the core and this is the general. You know, that was something that was really important to me when Ish and I started Racial Justice Organizing Committee. I mean, now it's gotten larger, so you have to have a core, just like we have the National Steering Committee. But even when we started the National Steering Committee, originally it was just a whole bunch of people in the room. And sometimes it's still like that. So the whole point is that, you know, it's about the organicness of people feeling welcoming. And people feel welcome when you use their ideas and you listen and you're like, oh, okay, I didn't think about that. Let's throw that in there too.
Thank you. Ryan, you got the next question?
Do I have one?
Yeah. Oh, actually, let me say it and then you can do the other one.
Okay.
So the next question is a pretty deep question that I've gotten before. So what do panelists suggest we should do when the district leadership, mostly Black, performs from a space of anti-Blackness and pacifying the teachers union? How to do right by Black, Indigenous, people of color children in such oppressive spaces?
Oh, can I say something? I didn't even turn my thing off. Clearly, I didn't even know that question. I must be psychic. That was coming. Because I was like, what a minute. Respectability politics from Black people in charge. Okay, here it is. Ignore them. And, you know, basically, so that ignore them, but understand. It is coming from a place of internalized oppression, which is unfortunate because I am a diehard labor person. I believe labor is important for Black people. especially when it comes to developing any sort of economic success, any sort of like middle class. I'm die hard line on that. But I do know that when unions ignore using racial justice as a lens, not just social justice. See, social justice is like, I'm just trying to do my best. Racial justice means that you are saying, I want to have an anti-racist lens. I'm going to include housing in my contract. I'm going to include Black and brown contracts and women of color getting contracts at the district. I'm going to include having robust conversations. It's okay for Black leadership and for Black parents on the ground and teachers on the ground who are like, this is wrong, to actually build a collective. You change those type of things to the district. And we can definitely talk about this in Philadelphia because we are functioning, our Black Lives Matter, we don't have any union support. We haven't had union support since Jesus died, which means we never had it. So it never happened. So the whole thing is that, and somehow it's been on the news, it's important. The school district now supports us, city council supports us, the union's like, cricket, that hasn't happened yet. And that's Black leadership. But we send them a letter every year. We put them on Facebook, Twitter now. We're like, well, AFT said yes. How about y'all? Wink, wink. You know what I'm saying? We looking at you. So the whole thing is that you just have to continue to push from the bottom up. And I'm going to give you even one more thing. You also have to push to get those people replaced. If people are not representing your best interest, they should not have that job. How are you going to take care and look out for Black children if you don't even know why it's important to be Black? Now, I don't want nobody to be unemployed. I just think people can make money doing something else. There's jobs all type of places. You could like run a sanitation company. I don't know, pick a job, but you don't have to work with children's lives. So that's another thing. And I think I love that thing. The union is not really for Black people. But if we go back to the history of the Black Teachers Union, which it was specifically for that. If we look at the auto workers union in Detroit, especially the people who like my mother, her first credit union account is the auto workers union as a teacher, not the teachers union, the auto workers union. So we also have to highlight that history. We also have to know that Black sharecroppers unionized, worked on those unions. So there's a great big history in how Black people have unionized and Black people taking over unions. And I do believe that when you really create a racial justice union, you have the will and the foresight to recreate the mechanisms within the union, to keep it from bringing just bread and butter and top down and making sure that it actually collects everything. Because one thing we do want to say, especially when we get into places where people getting paid pennies, like I think about how when I started subbing in Philadelphia, how it was the same amount I made when I was on maternity leave. My daughter is 20 years old. I subbed 4 years ago. That should not be a thing. 16 years came by and I was making less than I was per day. So these are definitely some things that, have to talk about. And I would definitely recommend bargaining for the common good. They're a great resource. Jobs for Justice is a great resource, the one out of Chicago. Because these are like how those, I think that is how you make that push. Is it perfect? No, but also these issues are not just issues in Milwaukee. We have seen this across most urban communities. Just because we like, oh, Black person finally in charge. I just said earlier that all skin folks, not your kin folks. They don't all care about you because they look like you. Because we're not a monolith, which is what Angela said. Just like white people hate other white people, Black people can do the same thing. But I'm telling you, it comes from internalized oppression and white supremacy.
I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Tamara, Ishmael, and Angela for today, for challenging us, definitely challenging me, my thought process. but most importantly for their leadership in making Black Lives Matter at School a national movement for educational justice. So thank you so much, appreciate it. Before we transition, we have a little bit of a surprise. Inspired by a visit from Dr. Bettina Love in January of 2020, multiple organizations got together to create the Coalition of Anti-Racist and Restorative Educators, or CARE, to continue to feed the fire that Dr. Love ignited. CARE is a grassroots coalition that has recruited more than 130 educators committed to creating anti-racist schools. And this year, the CARE planning team was honored with a new member. And so since the moment Angela Harris joined the team, she has provided this coalition heart, strategy, and vision. Her ability to build community, organize educators, deliver content expertise, and consistently challenge an education system that perpetuates white supremacy is unrivaled. So I'm gonna pass it off. We're gonna have a guest join us real quick here, maybe. There we go.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Definitely a pleasure to be able to sit in on this conversation. Programming for the entire week. I'm, Dom. I work as a community school coordinator here in Milwaukee. Also a part of the CARE planning team. And so with all of the beautiful words that Ryan just started with, we want to actually award the first Abolitionist of the Year award to Angela Harris for her just dedication, efforts, et cetera, et cetera. I see she tearing up back there. That was kind of the goal, not gonna lie. We was aiming for that.
Yeah.
But this, for us, it's all about, giving folks their flowers, right? I know there's a lot of effort that goes into anti-racist work and just equity work. And I would say specifically in Milwaukee, we don't do enough of like lifting up those individuals who are, being selfless, amplifying the voices of folks who may have forgotten that their voice matters too. Just showing up extremely authentic. She's been everything that, the city of Milwaukee needs when it comes to this type of work. So, happy to be able to present this award to you, Angela, Miss Harris, I'm sorry. There's a plaque there, and we also did a little poster design type of thing. I don't know if folks could read it or see it, but it's her picture that was featured in The Guardian. And around it is words that I feel are just describes her, right? So you see liberator, you see abolitionist, activist, an educator, freedom fighter, mother, leader, anti-racist educator, restorative, Black joy, right? And then there's a quote down on the bottom piece that says, speak the truth even when your voice shakes. And so, again, extremely honored to be able to present this award to you, Ms. Harris. So you're more than deserving.
Y'all know I'm gonna fight each and every one of y'all for messing my makeup up. We gonna, like, it's on site when I see y'all. I just want y'all to know. Oh my God, I'm so shocked. I don't even know what to say. I do this work because I out of the bottom of my heart, I'm walking in my purpose. And so I don't do it, like those of you who know me know I don't do it for the clout or for the likes or for a mural or nothing like that. I'm doing it sheerly for the liberation of these Black babies in Milwaukee. And so I just love y'all. I'm so mad that y'all did this to me. Y'all knew I was gonna cry. All right, you all. So we went over time with all of this love and support. I hope that your vessels were filled this week. whether it was the Student Amplify panel or hearing from Dr. Gholdy Muhammad, or the talent showcase and poetry night, or the intergenerational talkback last night, or this conversation about the Black Lives Matter at School book launch. I hope that you learned something. I hope that you will continue to amplify the work of Black Lives Matter Week of Action in our schools. It's not just a week of action, it is a year of purpose that will turn into a lifetime of practice. Thank you so much to all of our community sponsors, Leaders Igniting Transformation, MICAH, Black Educators Caucus, SURJ, Milwaukee Public Schools, Milwaukee Teachers Education Association, CARES, community schools. Thank you to all of the local elected officials that have supported us all week and showed up tonight. A special and huge thank you to Superintendent Posley for continuing to support this work 3 years later. Thank you to all of our community members who attended all of the events this week. Thanks again to our facilitators of the discussion, Ryan Hurley and Cindy Tenna. Thank you to Ishmael and Tamara for standing on my side tonight and holding me down. Thank you all. Make sure that you do the Padlet. Everybody have a great weekend. And remember, it's not just a week of action. It's a year of purpose that's going to turn into a lifetime of practice. Have a good night, you all.